Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the ASFPM virtual conference. You all are in session D5, Equity Considerations in Floodplain Management. I'm Mitch Payne, and I am a floodplain manager for King County in Seattle, Washington, and I'm really eager to moderate this session today, and we have 3 great speakers. So first up is Miriam Belblidia, who is a floodplain manager and resilience planner with Arcadis. So we'll have that first presentation, and then we'll have the Q&A. So please submit your Q&A, your questions in the chat box on the right side of the screen, and we'll get to those after our presentation. So we'll have the first presentation right now.
Hi, good morning. My name is Miriam Belblidia, and today I'll be speaking with you about equitable engagement for flood risk and resilience work. If you're joining our session today, then I am assuming that you're already conducting community engagement and are seeing some of the challenges of trying to do it in an equitable way. So today I'll be presenting some lessons learned from work that I've done in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I hope that we'll be able to continue the discussion during the Q&A session at the end. During the presentation today, I'll start with a little bit of an introduction to set the stage for our conversation. Then I'm going to go over some of the reasons why community engagement is both very simple, but also becomes complicated. Then I'm going to take us through a recommended process for community engagement based on the work in New Orleans, and then leave some time for questions about how this applies to our resilience and flood risk reduction work. Now, again, I just want to start by reiterating that community engagement is crucial and must be at the center of our resilience work, and that when it is done correctly, it actually results in better programs, plans, and projects. So I want to start this presentation by centering the fact that Black Lives Matter, and that everything that I know about equitable community engagement, I have been taught by Black and trans people. So anything that is presented today is the direct knowledge and kindness and patience that Black and trans folks have taken in educating me and that I am sharing with you. And the second point is that prioritizing white voices as experts is a form of covert white supremacy. So I want to name that as an issue in the fact that I'm sharing this with you. You'll see on the right-hand side a graphic that you may already be familiar with, but it just lists some of the forms of covert white supremacy that are socially acceptable. And you'll see in the arrows some of the things that I thought relate directly to our work in flood mitigation, in flood management. And these are issues that we really have to address. We need to address the racism that exists in our society if we do any of our work, but also especially in floodplain management, where the impacts of flooding disproportionately affect Black people. And I wanted to just highlight this article from Scientific American that you may have seen about the fact that flooding disproportionately harms Black neighborhoods. So, folks often make the argument that water does not discriminate. And the truth is that flood impacts do disproportionately impact Black people because of the history of segregation and redlining in this country. So the areas that are most at risk are often Black neighborhoods. According to analysis of federal flood insurance payments, flooding disproportionately is found to impact those neighborhoods. And we saw from damage during Hurricane Katrina that it was most extensive in the region's Black neighborhoods. So 4 out of 7 of the zip codes with the costliest flood damage had populations that were at least 75% Black. And we must consider this added layer of social vulnerability when it comes to flood risk. Black and poor Americans are more impacted, and they are going to have a more difficult time recovering from floods due to systemic racism. And we see this not only in New Orleans and Louisiana, but also in other parts of the country. So New York's most vulnerable populations are also those that are most vulnerable to climate change because they have often lived along the waterfronts that have not been invested in, and that are also affected by other issues such as toxic industrial sites. So poverty, lack of transportation, being isolated, these kinds of environmental justice issues, as well as the history of racism in this country and segregation, means that the impacts of flooding are borne disproportionately by Black Americans. So now I want to turn to a case study from New Orleans. So this work was developed by Imagine Waterworks, which is a nonprofit group located in New Orleans. And it was done by me for World Wildlife Fund. But the contributors here included a number of experts within the community. So I just want to highlight their contributions from Chastity Hunter, Alessandra Girolman, Clee Bear, and Amanda Emily Smith, without whom this work would not have been possible. And today I'm going to share some of the lessons that we learned in this case study and from the work that I've done in New Orleans and that I've been taught in New Orleans. This is going to inform some of the best practices that I'll highlight. So in looking at the New Orleans case study, there's many lessons and best practices that we can turn to. First, I want to reframe community engagement as a tool that can be used to directly address systemic racism. Community engagement is one of the things that is often required of us, and that is done in different ways to sort of, check that box and meet that requirement. But that if it is done intentionally, if it is done well, then it actually can be a tool to address some of the issues that are inherent in systemic racism, that it can improve the outcomes, and that it can dismantle some of the existing system that harms our communities. Second, I want to address the fact that we must balance respect for local and professional knowledge. Now, as planners, as certified floodplain managers, we often hold our knowledge above the expertise of folks that are in communities. And the truth is that we know that folks that are living in these communities know it best. They know where it floods. They often know the causes. And while they may not have an engineering degree, although some will, we have to respect the lived experience as being as important as our professional knowledge. And so if we are going to move forward, we have to decolonize these ideas around who is an expert. Residents are the experts in what is happening in their community. And in order to be more successful in the future, we have to have more balance in our respect for local and professional knowledge. Third, that community engagement can really be a tool to make these programs, plans, and projects more successful. And that one of the ways to do that, one of the ways to have more inclusive floodplain management, is rooted in this idea of co-creation. So rather than me as a planner, as a floodplain manager, coming into a community and deciding for them what is the best course of action, that we co-create the program or the plan together. And lastly, that we have to respect those historic and local approaches, that there is wisdom in the ways that communities have managed water. And that oftentimes we have an opportunity to return to that and that it may be more successful. So I want to just highlight some of those lessons and the framing around things that I have learned from a New Orleans case study. And again, sort of the basic premise here is that equitable community engagement improves our resilience and flood risk reduction work. We are not just doing this because it's the right thing to do. We are doing this because more equitable community engagement results in better projects, plans, outcomes. At the core of inequity, there is racism, and this impacts the safety net within which, residents live in these communities. And that in turn impacts the way in which they can deal with flood risk. So community engagement, when it's done intentionally, provides an opportunity to hear from those who are most impacted and to actually change the way that we do things. Now, when we talk about community, it can take on many different meanings. This can be a shared geography, identity, interest, goals. So for the sake of this case study, we're focusing on how to better manage flood risk by engaging the community of residents most impacted by flooding and allowing them to drive decision-making. While many nonprofit organizations, businesses, governments engage in flood management programs, plans, projects, community-driven engagement is often overlooked, or it's treated as secondary to the ideas and the priorities of those planners and engineers and local officials. And what I would offer today is that it's really crucial to engage residents on an equal footing if we're going to have better outcomes. Furthermore, in order to actually be successful in our work, then we need to have leadership from Black and trans residents. So the folks that are most impacted by flooding should be the ones to lead this work. And again, that when community engagement is done right, it offers a way to actually improve our plans, our programs, our projects, so that by incorporating the leadership of Black and trans residents, then we're going to have better outcomes. We're going to be able to incorporate more traditional ecological knowledge, historical data, community wisdom, and that is going to be information that as outside planners or facilitators, we will not possess unless we are intimately familiar, unless we live in that community. So, we have to spend the time and invest in being able to have leadership from the folks that are most impacted. And this is where it's important to note that, community engagement is actually quite simple, but we often make it complicated. Community engagement, in order to be equitable, it really requires three things: time, a dedicated and sustained effort, and resources. It is really that simple. But it must be intentional in order to succeed. In New Orleans, community engagement has historically been done by holding meetings to present plans that are already in motion. And this is not just isolated to New Orleans, this applies really, I would say, across the board. And this model of engagement does not allow for adequate input, and it can result in distrust of the programs, the planning efforts, the proposed infrastructure projects that we're working on. So in a city like New Orleans, though, with a very high level of civic engagement and a heightened awareness of flood risk, residents have attended so many meetings since Hurricane Katrina. They've offered their time and insight and expertise to planners and project managers. And much of this wisdom does not end up being incorporated into these flood management projects. Often because the grant program has restrictions, or we don't leave enough time in the project budget for community engagement, or we prioritize the expertise of planners over residents. And we'll see these rooms in which these projects are being developed that do not reflect the communities in which they are making decisions for. So the reason that is often cited by project staff for a lack of community engagement process is a lack of funding. And I just want to be clear that programs, plans, projects should not proceed unless there is funding in place to adequately engage residents. We need to have adequate resources to support these residents' participation. Now, just as consultants are paid to participate in community meetings, residents need to have their wisdom compensated, and it needs to be respected and incorporated into our plans for flood mitigation. So again, community engagement works best when we intentionally engage Black and trans residents and build relationships that are based on mutual trust and respect for local wisdom. And trust building takes time. It takes a real sustained effort and actually following through on the promises that are made. And this also means that we have to be implementing the programs, plans, or projects that actually address the needs that are articulated by residents. Back to, if folks take the time to share their wisdom, to share their knowledge with us through a community planning, through community engagement, then we have to show that that those concerns are being addressed. And the best way to do this, if possible, is to actually allow those residents who are most impacted by flooding to participate or lead the project. And, again, if we do not do this, if we ask for input and then fail to use it, it's going to erode that trust that is critical. And part of this question of community engagement, we should really be asking ourselves, who is being engaged? And if they're not being engaged, then why not? And that gets back to this point that community engagement must be adequately resourced. So back to this question of why folks may not be engaged, right? So if you're a local planning official and you have a community meeting, we should be thinking about who is in the room and who is not in the room and why they may not be in the room. And so we have to consider, what are some of the potential barriers to community engagement? So if you're organizing any sort of community-facing event or meeting, you want to be thinking about things like the location of the meetings, if there's transportation, is it accessible by public transit, or do you need to have a car in order to attend? Will there be childcare that's provided? If not, how are folks that don't have the benefits of a babysitter going to be able to attend? Or are children welcome to come to these meetings? Are there translation services that can be provided? What is the accessibility of the building itself? And, one thing that's always important to consider is, can food be provided? One of the easiest ways to have a successful community engagement meeting is to provide food, in addition to thinking through and being intentional about all of these different considerations. So again, community engagement takes time, it takes intentional effort, it takes resources, but this is ultimately going to be worth it. When it's done right, it really does result in better programs, plans, projects. And we want to be doing this because if we don't consider these barriers, then we're not hearing from the people who are most impacted, who we need to hear from the most. So those were some of the lessons learned from the work that I've done in New Orleans with Mountain Waterworks. And now I wanted to just go through sort of a recommended process for equitable engagement. Now, this is not necessarily a linear process. Some of this is ongoing, but a very good starting point for any project is to develop very clear values and goals. So if you have a plan, if you have any sort of initiative, you really want to be clear and put into writing what are your values and your goals. And this is important not just to be transparent, to build trust, but it's also important to be able to hold those facilitators and the organizations involved accountable. Second, you really need to be building those relationships and trust. And ideally, initiatives should be building upon existing relationships or be forming new ones with residents that are in the impacted area. So if you are new to working in an area and you don't have those existing relationships, it's really important to do the research. Make sure you know who the local stakeholders are and determine what work has already been done so that you can build upon it rather than recreating it. Next, it's important to have community residents in a leadership role. So this is one of the best ways to make an initiative successful. And there's a few different ways that you can do this. You could either involve residents directly on the project team, or you could create an advisory committee. But it's really important that the folks that are most impacted be involved in the leadership of a project. Another thing to consider is how we can hold ourselves accountable, right? As we're all doing this work, as we're all sort of consistently learning and messing up and doing better, it's important to have ways that we can hold ourselves to the values and goals that we state at the beginning. And so again, you want to be sharing these values and goals publicly, and you want to make sure that all of your team members are really held to them and that there's ways to be accountable to those values and goals. You also want to develop a shared timeline. So, a project may not be moving at the community's pace and comfort level. And it's important to account for a tendency to impose outside timelines. It's best to model for your community engagement that you're going to be going through this timeline with different leaders and stakeholders in the community and make sure that it works for them. And then to speak with the funders or whoever is leading the initiative and make sure that they're understanding that it's important that the community really be able to set the pace. And that doesn't mean that the project doesn't, move forward on, a fast timeline. Often residents do want to see progress, but it does mean that they really need to be setting the timeline for a project. Additionally, it's important to compensate residents for their time and expertise. So, again, if we are respecting their knowledge and their time, then it's important for them to be compensated in the same way that consultants are paid. And as an organization, you can determine how this is best handled. It could be through stipends or through full or part-time positions within the organization, depending on what level of time commitment, expertise that's being asked of residents. But if we go back to the fact that the folks that are going to be most impacted by flooding are the folks that have been systemically denied access to resources, then we have to be trying to undo some of that by fairly compensating them for their time. And an example that way that we did this in New Orleans was the water leadership program that I co-developed we had 20 residents that we accepted in this pilot program, and we provided them with a $300 stipend for their participation in 15 hours of workshops and field trips. And this was provided, the funding came from different foundations. And then at the end, we also made small subgrants available in which they could implement what they learned through this water leadership program back in their home neighborhoods. So that was one way in which we tried to respect the fact that everybody in the program was coming with their own expertise and that it was important to recognize that. And this is related to the importance of respecting those local traditions, local knowledge. So, we have to be thinking about the community's expertise as equal to our different professional or scientific knowledge. We want to decolonize our ideas around what expertise is. We want to avoid making different assumptions about the expertise of individuals in the room. At a community meeting, you will have engineers, you will have folks that have lived on a street for many years and know it better than, the model that we may be consulting. So just want to recognize that residents are going to bring a wealth of experience and expertise, and that includes professional, scientific, cultural, and historic knowledge. And, we don't want to just be listening to our own opinions or our own sort of voices reflected back, that we have to be listening to the folks that are most impacted. And so lastly, we want to be just thinking about how our practices fit in a local context. So, it's important to exchange knowledge and share solutions from other contexts, but we really do want to be understanding what's going to work locally. So, as you leave this presentation, as we head into questions, I want you to be thinking about how can different elements of this process, how can these recommendations be incorporated into your resilience and flood risk management work? And finally, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And again, I just want to end by acknowledging that many of the photos in this presentation and the knowledge that was contributed here directly came from Clee Bear, who is the co-director of Imagine Waterworks, and without whom I would not have learned the information that I presented here today. So thank you all for listening, and please let me know if you have questions.
Great. Thanks, Miriam, for such a great presentation. Looks like we have time for a couple questions. So I'm going to start with the first one. In this time of COVID and having to do a lot of virtual engagement, can you speak a little bit to the inequities that surround virtual engagement processes?
Sure, thank you. And I hope that folks took some things from this presentation. So a few things that I would say about COVID and considerations for equitable engagement. So first off, there are ways that you can use digital engagement to actually reach more people than if you had an in-person meeting. So, one of the issues that you are going to face is obviously that there are digital divides and not everybody has access to the internet, right? And that is something you'll have to work around. And there's ways that you can create, physical like packets of information or other ways that you can engage neighbors. But I would say that actually with everything being online, sometimes it's easier for folks to engage than if they had to go physically to a meeting and they had to get childcare or transportation. So I would say that in some cases, there's more opportunities for equitable engagement during COVID. And I hope that some of the lessons that we're learning during COVID for how to expand accessibility when it comes to providing online engagement opportunities, that will continue even after COVID.
Great. And then what advice would you have for communities that may not have received a recent flood event and may not have that same kind of familiarity with the flooding as a hazard, like New Orleans residents faced?
Yeah, I mean, in New Orleans, I guess the fact that we have such regular flooding, and I'm not just talking about Katrina, right? We have regular street flooding due to rainfall. Um, that does keep the issue sort of at the forefront of people's minds, and that can be helpful. I will say, though, that there's many different opportunities to engage folks, either referencing sort of the flood of record for your community, or just other ways in which you're sharing information about climate change, sharing information about what the hazards are that can keep folks engaged. And I think that if we use, we talk about sort of ways to mobilize when it's not raining, when there's not flooding. I think that if we can link the fact that if you address just underlying inequities within the community that persist every day, that those will actually have better outcomes also for flooding. That may be one way that even if your community hasn't been hit recently, I'm sure there are other issues that relate to flood risk.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think that's all the time we have for questions. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Great. So our next presentation is going to be from Anna Zimmerman, who is an immunologist with the College of Charleston. So we'll hear her presentation and then talk through questions and answers afterwards.
Greetings, my name is Anna Zimmerman, and today I'm going to talk about a flood history disclosure, a case study from Charleston, South Carolina, and the case study involves my own house. It's fitting that my talk today is in the track of risk communications and equity considerations in floodplain management. And hopefully by the end of today's talk, I will maybe convince some of you, although many of you don't need convincing, that violations in NFIP requirements put people at risk, and non-compliance with FEMA requirements really does harm innocent families, and it puts a tremendous burden on the federal taxpayer. I've organized my talk around 4 main themes, being flood disclosure, violations, CRS, and really a plea for a need for FEMA enforcement. And hopefully the takeaway message from my talk today will be one of, really, should federal tax dollars be used to cover for post-firm building code violations? So a little bit about me. I'm a mom first, teacher second, a scientist, and really an unintentional flood activist. This was never my calling, but I found myself in a peculiar situation that I will explain part of my story today. So really, I was just trying to live my best life. And I came to Charleston in 2005 with a new child in tow, my husband and I, some cats. We were first-time homeowners, and it was an exciting time. New opportunities all around. So we looked and we looked and we looked, and we probably looked at 24 different houses. And every house, our criteria was good school district. We were looking for something with a backyard would be nice. And every house that we looked at, we asked about Hurricane Hugo, what had happened in 1989, were there any problems with the house, that sort of thing. And the house that we ended up with was purchasing a house on Shoreham Drive. And here is a picture of the house that we ended up purchasing. Later, my daughter thought the color was awful. She called it the naked house because it had naked paint color. So point 1 of my talk is about flood disclosure, and we did the best that I think any new homeowner can do, in that we asked about flood disclosure. We asked around if the house had problems. We hired an inspector. We basically hired a real estate agent to help us out with this. We had disclosure statements, but what we ended up finding later was that no matter how much due diligence that we would have done, we would have never found the problems with the house that we purchased. And this is an actual property disclosure from Shoreham Road, and what you can see here is number 15, violations or variances, checkbox was no. If we had any problems that were caused by water, check no. If there were flood hazards, flood designations, check no. So, a home of one's own. The naked color had to go. We painted the house, we fixed it up, we spent years with a garden, and we loved our home. And in 2015, our house flooded. It was awful. And just when we seemed to get back on our feet, our house was hit by Hurricane Irma, and it flooded again in 2017. And this happened during the middle of the day, and we could see that water was coming from 4 different directions in the neighborhood. Again, ruined all of our stuff. And at this point, the FEMA adjuster had told us that this property was a total loss and put in a claim for it being a total loss. So basically, in a 24-hour period, we went from having a place to live to what are we going to do with rebuilding, these sorts of things. Within 2 weeks, basically, we knew that we didn't have a place to live. And so we started to make as best plans as you can. So we ended up, because the house was deemed to be a total loss, the FEMA adjuster suggested that we applied to FEMA to have FEMA basically knock the house down. And there was something called an increased cost of compliance that was present in our insurance. And we had thought about, getting the house elevated. Maybe we could fix it up. We could move back into it. We could sell it to someone else. But once we started talking to the floodplain manager, we realized that this was really a no-win situation, because even if we knocked the house down, we came to learn that there was an elevation problem. And so it seemed that there were no good options at this point. For the ICC component, I needed something called a substantial damage letter. The city floodplain manager wrote such a letter for me, and he also indicated that this was the first time that the city had ever written such a letter. And as the years went by, the more that I mulled this over in my head, this just seemed unreal to me that substantial damage letters hadn't been issued in the city of Charleston. The more that I read, the more that I came to learn that this was a requirement of being in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so I started FOIA requesting information, and lo and behold, yes, my house was the first house ever in the city of Charleston to ever have a substantial damage letter. And I find that to just be unbelievable. And also during this time, I started digging up through more information, reading all kinds of NFIP documentation, FEMA documentation, because I was trying to understand what had gone wrong here. And what I did find was, up until that time, Charleston had also not been doing required inspections after floods. They'd not been requiring permits for flood repairs, in addition to the not issuing substantial damage letters. And I really did find that astounding, given how many floods have happened in Charleston, going from Hurricane Hugo all the way down to Matthew to Irma, and even recently, this is still going on, not doing required inspections after floods, not requiring permits for flood repairs, and not issuing substantial damage letters. I also started tracking down previous homeowners on Shoreham Road. Coinciding with this time, FEMA had actually come back and denied our total loss claim due to building code violations that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And I also came to find out that the flood disclosure statements on my house were never accurate, and that my house had in fact flooded 5 times before we had ever purchased our home. And if you remember from the flood disclosure statements, the property disclosures, we were also told by the realtor and the people selling our house that there were no problems with our house when it came to flooding or water. So maybe a detriment of being a scientist is that really I want to understand. And scientists, they collect all the data that they can in many cases when they're trying to solve a problem and try to make sense of it. So it became basically my year, 2 years, now it's running on 3 years almost, of me reading every single document that I can seem to get a hold of that would help me understand what in the heck has gone wrong. And so if I went back to some documents, and I went all the way back to the 70s, I went back to documents before I was born, documents when I was in high school, I saw that all of these FEMA requirements that the city had been ignoring and not following, all of these violations were things that the city had in their own ordinances that they had passed to comply with the NFIP. When I look at the ordinances, FEMA had first floor elevations that were required. The city had adopted that into their ordinances. They had in their ordinance way back from 1977 how you cannot improve or repair structure without bringing it up to code. That has sustained over 50% the value of the structure. They had in their ordinance FEMA policies in place that floodproofing is limited to non-residential structures, and they also had in their ordinance taken almost verbatim from FEMA requirements rules about variances. Flood maps, and found the flood map from when my house was constructed, and the flood map at that time for the area of Shoreham Road, and Shoreham Road is right in here. Shoreham Road was part of a subdivision called Willow Walk, and this was in 1986, before my house was ever permitted, before my house was ever built, was deemed to have a base flood elevation of 12 feet. And if we look at Shoreham Road, all of the houses that were constructed on Shoreham Road in a post-firm era with a flood map with a elevation requirement of 12 feet, all of the first floor elevations of these homes fell below this requirement of 12 feet. So from the get-go, my house was basically destined to flood. And I wondered, how could this have been possible? How could you construct an entire subdivision to be below BFE requirements? And what I learned was rather astounding. I tracked down former Shoreham owners all over town, and I found deeds from properties. And basically what the city had done was they had bypassed the FEMA map and basically put that the houses on Shoreham Road on the deeds were in a C flood zone. They were never in a C flood zone. They were, if we remember back from that map, 1986, they were in an A flood zone, and it was an A5, 12 feet elevation requirement. So dig, 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 and the problems just seemed to be multiplying as I was doing so. We're finding certificates of occupancy that were indicating that these houses met standard building codes, which they didn't because of the elevation problem. And then I was keyed into the fact that there was a variance problem as well with this house. And so that was a new one to me, a new problem, a new thing to try to explore. And I was then told by a city official that the variance would not be found. And after many, many emails to various people in the city to try to get the variance, the floodplain manager was also very helpful at that time. And he indicated to me that I should request this information through FOIA requests, and did so, still could not get the variance. Well, you know, telling someone that they cannot find a variance that's associated with their home when their flood claim has been denied and now they're in panic mode, you know, really sent me to looking at where else could I find this variance. I'm persistent, and I did find the variances from FOIA requests to the Atlanta office of FEMA to Washington, D.C., among other agencies. And I kid you not, this turned out to be hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of information that I had to dig through to basically find that the city was allowing post-firm houses to be sold and occupied under BFE. And then even the transcripts of these discussions where they were approving these variances, they were even saying in these meetings that, well, we're not supposed to do this. This is against FEMA rules, but, our intent is this, and they did it anyway. And basically, this infuriated me because innocent people, my neighbors on Shoreham, several of us have now lost our houses. People are going into foreclosure situations. It was astounding that this could be possible and that nothing was ever enforced. And I did find that the city did also get FEMA reprimand letters for 2 of the 3 Shoreham variances. So the first variance was to allow houses to be sold and occupied that were under BFE in a post-firm era. And the second variance was the city went ahead and houses that were also under BFE that were residential structures, the city was allowing them to be occupied under BFE by saying that the houses had been flood-proofed. I don't really know what flood-proofed is. I cannot find any evidence of the houses on Shoreham Road of what this flood-proofing means. The houses are still flooding, mind you. And again, I found transcripts that say, FEMA requirements do not specifically allow for the flood-proofing of residential structures, but they did it anyway. And so this made me very, very upset. And it basically was, no matter how much due diligence you do for buying a house on Shoreham Road, it is unbelievable that your due diligence would have to include 2 years of FOIA requests from FEMA and thousands of documentations to try to figure out what in the heck went wrong. And then I found a variance that was specific to my own house, and previous owners this is a house that's under BFE, mind you. My house was 3 feet below BFE, and the previous owners had requested to enclose the garage space to convert it to living space. And I don't really need to tell this group, but you're not allowed to enclose garages that are under BFE to be converted to living space. And they did so anyway, and they kind of combined the problems that they had already been reprimanded with in variance 1, and then the problems of variance 2, and they basically, in variance 3, that was specific to my house, they combined all the bad deeds, so to speak, in allowing this to go ahead and happen. And then my own house had a FEMA reprimand letter that was attached to it over this problematic variance with the enclosed garage structures. So now I've come to all kinds of NFIP and FEMA violations that are going on with the city of Charleston, and this is problematic to me. Innocent people are having their livelihoods destroyed while there are all these violations that this is the reason for that. So the scientist in me collects the data, compiles it together, alerts the city, and I really did expect the city would go ahead and rectify this problem. Oh, I was so naive. So I find myself reporting all of this information and giving pages and pages and pages and pages of things to the city again, but nothing ever happens. So I decide to make my house an example. I make this Zillow ad thinking that I'll post this. It will be embarrassing to the city. Maybe they'll go ahead and they'll deal with Shoreham Road. We make a video. We actually started filing complaints outside of the city because nothing was happening. No help to the people of Shoreham. And I spray paint the inside of my house, try to make an example of my house and these problems. So I make an example of my house. I realize it's not just my house. This is Shoreham right here. My house was here. It's multiple houses on Shoreham, and I've put these little icons that are flooding, and they're all under BFE. My subdivision is under BFE. It's not just my garage that's enclosed. I go around counting garages and find over 50 of them. Problems, problems, problems. Meanwhile, because the city will not help the residents on Shoreham Road, they're still not issuing substantial damage letters. We're having multiple different flooding events. We have meetings with the city. The city tells us nothing will be done. The only thing that will be done is FEMA will cover these losses. covering for building code violations, that seems a little bit questionable. So people start bailing left and right. And I don't blame people for doing unto others what was done unto them. Many people did not have a choice. And so we have all of these houses that are being sold on Shoreham Road. None of them are disclosing the variances. None of them are disclosing the elevation issues that are going on, and many of them are being flipped over and over and over, and the new owners have no idea about the flooding history of the houses that they have purchased. And even now, there are current NFIP claims going on for houses that have flooded upwards of 9 times. Still no substantial damage letters to this street. Where do we go? Where do we go from here? So all kinds of non-compliance issues for decades, yet Charleston is a 6 in the CRS. So 3 of us decide to actually write a letter to the federal government, to FEMA, to the ISO who does the CRS designations, and ask for enforcement. We spent an entire summer working on, basically as scientists do, collecting all the data, writing it in a clear, concise format. You can go ahead and download our letter, which is here on this, the address is here on this page, to basically spell it out to FEMA, to tell them everything that we have found, thinking that there's no way that we can be ignored at the federal level. And this gets front page on the local newspaper. And we're just ordinary citizens trying to figure out what the heck went wrong. And our ultimate goal is we just want things fixed. We see what's going on, how it's hurt people in our neighborhoods, and we find out that the substantial damage problem, not reporting, this is all over Charleston. This isn't just Shoreham. This isn't just my subdivision. This is the historic district that's going on downtown. These are areas in West Ashley. We have hundreds of homes that are flooding, and the city is taking a very laissez-faire attitude towards enforcement. It was very disappointing to us that we spent all of this time putting all of this information together. It's been years of work, actually, and the approach from the city was basically to have an editorial written that is making us the problem for bringing the facts. So, you know, we kind of had these discussions about, like, why are they shooting the messenger? All we want to do is fix something.
You could put the city on probation and say, look, you have to stop this madness.
Charleston Mayor Tecklenburg says they get a new FEMA review every year, and right now, he says they stand pretty good.
We rate already a 6. That means the city of Charleston is already meeting requirements that's well above the minimum requirements that FEMA requires.
And the next CAV visit takes into account all of those issues that we had described in our 17-page letter, and they concurred with our findings that the city was in serious non-compliance with several different issues, and they indicated that to the city, but that was 2 years ago, and really nothing has changed. Still don't have substantial damage assessments for the past 3 years of flooding, still not making substantial damage determinations, even over the last flood, which happened in April of 2020 over on Shoreham Road. There was not inspections done after flooding, and there are currently open FEMA claims with that as well. So, you know, what can we do? FEMA knows what's going on. We know what's going on. The city knows what's going on. But this city, left to its own devices, I'm really convinced it cannot help itself. And at this point, we really do need FEMA intervention to get these problems fixed. So thank you today for listening to my story. All I can say is it has been a very long, strange trip indeed. Many times I feel like I'm a canary in the coal mine, but I tell my story because I do think that it is important to hear from the flood survivor, flood activist part of the equation to floodplain management in this country. I don't know how Shoreham's going to end. My ultimate hope is that because the problem started with the city, that the city will be able to rectify this problem. And I do thank my family for never wavering in their support of me trying to do the right thing and make sure that this doesn't happen to another family. It's not always comfortable having your mom, your family in the newspaper, much less on prime time. Or the subject of a podcast, or being called a face of disaster. And through all this, I've met some of the most interesting people in my own city. People that together we've been able to rent a church, throw a flood meeting. We actually really threw a flood party. We've organized workshops to inform others about flood insurance. People telling their stories is profoundly important. And there are a lot of people out there with stories to tell. And hopefully, by working together with agencies such as your organization, FEMA, we can make a positive difference. And there are many flood organizations that Harriet Festing with Higher Ground has made an amazing website where you can basically go to the Higher Ground website and you can click on information about each of these different organizations. I've highlighted here with red arrows just some that are in South Carolina, and I really have to thank these organizations because they have been extremely supportive, helpful, and informative. So in closing, I have many people that I would like to acknowledge and thank, and also thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope that I will get some questions from some of you in the Q&A session.
Floodplain managers and people in this, where we can totally understand your situation, and thanks for sharing your story to everybody. We've got a lot of questions, and I think a lot of people are really interested in some very specific things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but one question here is, what would you consider Charleston reaching for solutions? If they chose to take action, what would you consider success looking like?
Success, I think, for Charleston, one would be that they have to be held accountable for following FEMA regulations and rules. I mean, there's wisdom that are behind the reason that those are in place, and we cannot just ignore them, because the burden, then we're socializing the risk, and then the risk is completely put on innocent families and federal taxpayers. People in Kansas should not be paying for the problems that are going on in Charleston. So I think, number one, that has to be the city has to be held accountable for following these. Secondly, the city has to mitigate problems that were created by the city of Charleston. And so, for Shoreham Road, I've always been of the mindset that the city has to buy out that street. This is a street that is a working class neighborhood, has Black families on it, white families, young, old, gay, straight, trans, married, single, multi-generational families, native, non-native speakers, college educated, not, people that are street smart and people that are not street smart. But this was the beauty of this one street. And if we as a city cannot, this one should be easy. This was caused by the city allowing all of these illegal variances. The city should be held responsible to that. If we cannot, this one should be easy because there is someone to blame. There is someone to fault. If my house had been destroyed by a natural event, like a hurricane, that was a natural event, I could have dealt with that, but I cannot deal with that. This is completely preventative flooding that could have happened. And so for the residents, the taxpayers that live on this street, it has been very disappointed that the city would treat its own people like this. And if this is a street that should be easy because the documentation all goes back to the city city should fix this problem. If we can't fix this problem of one street, I don't think there is success in Charleston. I think that when we do have a natural disaster, such as a hurricane, and it's not if, it's when, if we can't take care of one street, how are we going to take care of the whole city? So
Absolutely.
we need to admit that there are problems and deal with them and find solutions would be success for me. And I'd be willing to help with that if any way I could.
Absolutely. And there have been a couple questions about the Anthropocene Alliance. Can you talk a little bit more about the group?
Yes. So actually, that group is the Anthropocene Alliance is the umbrella group, and under that is a group called Higher Ground. And Higher Ground is a consortium of different flood groups, flood activist groups, and really they're groups that have been grassroots organizations that have sprung up in a response to flooding in the communities. And so this is run by Harriet Festing. And for me, this has been a phenomenal group to be part of. We have every month, we have different speakers that speak to us by Zoom. We've even had Chad from the Association of Floodplain Managers come and talk to us. And we've had people from the Pew Charitable Trust. We had Gilbert Gall. We've had Pulitzer Prize winner authors that have written about flooding. And that's been fantastic to learn about those things in these Zoom meetings. It's also been fantastic to have people to talk to about what have you done? What has your approaches been? How have you filed for FOIA requests? All of that all over the country, and hear different success stories, different failures, different lessons to be learned. And they've also been, Harriet's just amazing. She has been able to garner grant support from the Kresge Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Environmental Defense Fund, among others, in order to help support some of these efforts that people are trying to do. We would have never been able to rent a venue, a church, which was very open to all, host a flood meeting, assist people with FEMA insurance, all of these things. I mean, we provided food, like the previous presenter had indicated, to make people vested in their communities. And so that has been fantastic that we have that group in America right now. And I think that we really probably, with floodplain management in this country, I mean, this was never like something that I thought that I would get into, but we do have a lot of people like myself that want to help. We want to be part of the solution. We've been part of the problem. We'd like to be part of the solution. And so I think that Higher Ground has a role in floodplain management in the United States to tap into the residents that have been affected. I mean, maybe floodplain managers don't know all the problems in their communities until people have encountered them, until people will come and be about that. And so I think that it's just great. If you have not looked as a floodplain manager on the Higher Ground site, if one of the things that you want to do as a floodplain manager is reach out to the communities that are affected, you might have grassroots organizations that are already there that would welcome being part of the solution.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your presentation. And there have been a lot of comments to keep up the fight. And
Okay.
I'll echo that.
Thank you.
Yep, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you again for joining us. And now we're going to move on to our third presentation for this session. It's by Marcus Coleman, who's a senior associate with HWC. And he has some co-presenters, so hopefully he can introduce them in the Q&A. So we'll roll the presentation now.
Howdy ASFPM, and welcome to this online concurrent session. We all hope to be able to meet in Texas this year, but in the true spirit of resilience, we're here because we're committed to doing the very best we can with what we've got. HWC is thrilled to be a part of this distinguished group of experts and practitioners conferencing virtually this year to bring you this session on participatory design for greater stakeholder inclusion and better resilience outcomes. I'm Amber McIntyre, Strategic Communications Specialist and Senior Associate at HWC. Today, I'm joined by two of my favorite colleagues and subject matter experts, Certified Floodplain Manager and Stakeholder Engagement Specialist, Alex Schutello, and Emergency Management and Partnership Specialist and Senior Associate, Marcus Coleman. Over the course of today's discussion, Alex, Marcus, and I will focus on two key objectives. One, we want to help elevate the discussion of what equitable stakeholder engagement outcomes look like when leveraging the concept of participatory design. We also want to share how these principles may be key to unlocking the next level of stakeholder engagement for floodplain and emergency managers. By highlighting specific effective models and resources, we believe you can take participatory design and apply it at the organizational, community, and national level to encourage deliberate actions before, during, and after disasters. During today's presentation, we'll cover what participatory design is. We'll take a look at how HWC's approach to participatory design informs our work, and then we'll talk about PD at the intersections of emergency management, insurance, cooperating technical partnerships, and state, local, territorial, and tribal communities. Finally, we'll unpack ways to leverage participatory design in a virtual world. Our goal is simple. It is to help uncover how a participatory design approach can help improve, strengthen, and enhance the ability of stakeholder engagement strategies, plans, and tactics to actually meet their goals. Participatory design, or PD, is a creative approach to engaging and co-creating with communities to address local issues. The concept of participation is rapidly becoming a catch-all. The term of participation, however, has been interpreted in many different ways, ranging from passive participation, which is where people are included in a project merely by being told about it, to self-mobilization, where people take the initiative and responsibility with or without limited external influence. Payne and Francis define participatory design as an approach and technique that places emphasis on participants producing detailed accounts of a certain topic using their own words and frameworks of understanding. This approach arose as a result of the perceived limitations of a top-down approach through a promotion of participation and an involvement of local people. As Payne and Francis have noted, the defining characteristics of participatory design is not so much on the methods and techniques employed, but the degree of engagement of participants with and beyond the program lifecycle. Thus, the idea of participatory design or a participatory approach is to discover solutions to problems from participants or local communities through participatory techniques. At HWC, participatory design informs how we support work that influences how practitioners and public officials can build or build upon their existing engagement best practices. To be more inclusive of other stakeholders in the outreach process, we believe lowering the barriers to entry for stakeholders to define the process of framing the problem and exploring possible solutions is best with them at the table, not after decisions have been made. In essence, we are working with our clients and partners within their existing communications and decision-making norms and helping them broaden the scope of their communications so that communities can convene around and work through mutually agreed upon problems, finding solutions together. We've even seen PD at play and can vouch for its effectiveness. Done correctly, PD can help get non-customary stakeholders involved early in things like the mapping process, or to help create non-regulatory products that could be better used for more tailored local planning. We don't believe that PD should be imposing or significantly challenging to your external engagement structures or guidelines. By sharing insights, perspectives, and viewpoints when it comes to building the structures and relationships that guide policy, processes, and people, we believe it should be done collectively.
Hi, my name is Alex Chatello, Certified Floodplain Manager, Communications Expert, and Senior Associate at HWC. At HWC, we're so grateful to be working in the disaster management space. I've been working in resilience and community outreach for the better part of a decade, and I can tell you that the concept of participatory design is one of the most effective ways to help communities build resilience. Why? Because when local leaders seek the buy-in and knowledge from key stakeholders, communities are more prone to consider mitigation actions which protect them long-term. Floodplain managers have the tools, insights, and network to advance the application of participatory design into their stakeholder engagement efforts. The principles and practices of participatory design encourage engagement at the local level. Floodplain managers, local leaders, and even the public all have a seat at the table. Today, I'm going to tell a story about the Cooperating Technical Partners Program, a FEMA grant program established back in 1999 to encourage partnership building with external local, state, and regional government agencies as well as tribal nations. In December 2014, FEMA's branch chiefs came together and questioned the value of the CTP program. In January 2015, I began working with FEMA to determine the efficacy of the program by looking at ways to garner feedback to inform how the program could grow and mature. We knew generally that CTPs at the time didn't feel like trusted partners, and there were disconnects between FEMA and the FEMA regions about the program, its management, operations, and best practices. FEMA therefore set out on a mission to look at every facet of the CTP program. First, we established monthly meetings and working groups to help develop internal communications and build trust and collaboration. Step 1 in the participatory design process was for headquarters to bring the regions to the table first and ask for their opinions and thoughts in evaluating the CTP program. One of the best ways to encourage stakeholders and partners to join you at the table is to ask their honest opinions about how relationships are working. FEMA headquarters and the regions worked together to develop a feedback survey, and we then launched an outreach strategy to encourage feedback from CTPs and other partners and stakeholders about the program in an effort to determine its strengths, weaknesses, and areas for improvement. Step 2 in the participatory design process is to provide some sort of inclusive effort for all stakeholders. Findings from the CTP program feedback survey provided information in a number of areas shown here. We worked closely with FEMA, and before we even socialized this data, we leveraged our working groups to make sure that we were identifying the right concepts to make sure that everyone felt they were heard. Step 3 in the participatory design process is to make sure that we are equitable and fair in how we show our findings. But FEMA also had an opportunity to lean in and provide guidance with regard to the types of things we could tackle in a CTP program operations plan. We then talked about next steps with our stakeholders, and as part of Step 4 in the participatory design process, we encouraged their feedback over and over again. One of the great tenets of participatory design is how well you design your outreach strategy. FEMA made sure there were ample ways to share information across FEMA and across our partners, both internal and external. We left no stakeholder behind. We leveraged existing meetings to give program updates, and we invited ourselves to give updates at conferences and other external meetings. We developed internal partnerships across FEMA, PTS and CERC contractors, and our CTPs themselves in a collaborative format every single month. This slide showcases just how many engagements we had. We tried to be over-inclusive, and through time, CTPs and others across FEMA recognized our efforts and saw the impacts of the relationships we built, which in turn improved communications, collaboration, and our ability to tackle the toughest problems when they arose. We all worked together as a team. The success of the CTP program came from relationships built from the participatory design process, including leveraging opportunities such as a community of practice, a CTP steering committee, online biannual stakeholder meetings, virtual stakeholder meetings and training, in-person and online training opportunities, and other ways of monthly regional engagement, to name a few. In closing, one of the biggest successes from employing the principles of participatory design was the development of the CTP program 5-year operations plan. The plan, which was approved by FEMA in March 2018, was a great accomplishment for FEMA and the CTP program. The 5 main goals of the program were identified in partnership with our stakeholders. They included improving training, evaluating and developing risk map tools and resources, implementing collaboration strategies, integrating performance measures, and evaluating communications and local engagement. Participatory design, when done right, can be a boon to any program or mission. For FEMA, it gave them a great platform to lead the growth and development of the CTP program. During my tenure, FEMA introduced program measures, launched a training program, and the CTP recognition program as well, all stemming from leveraging the best practices of participatory design.
Throughout the course of this presentation, we heard about how the various principles and elements of participatory design apply to floodplain management, including taking a look specifically at participatory design's role and impact on emergency management, and floodplain management in particular through the Cooperating Technical Partners Program, I want to provide you 2 examples of participatory design in action. The first example I want to offer up is with the nation's oldest civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP, as they're known as, partnered with Climate Central and NOAA to hold workshops across the country on how the NAACP members in the community can get a better understanding and handle on understanding their flood risk from sea level rise, coastal flooding, and other types of flood risks that are going to affect socially vulnerable and medically fragile communities. The key point here is that there's going to be a lot of untraditional partners that may have interests that align with what you're seeking to do as a floodplain manager, but in addition to taking an ear and listening to some of their needs it was also about spending enough time to understand how the various cultures across the country work. We applaud and acknowledge the work of those floodplain managers and those officials who spent time with the NAACP before deploying a workshop that they had in a box to make sure that the information, the terminology, and the engagement style aligned with the NAACP members themselves. The second example is from the city of Baltimore. Through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and various residents and leaders within the city of Baltimore, they had developed what's known as a wildly popular game, the Game of Floods. We weren't a part of developing the Game of Floods, but the thing that I want to acknowledge here is that it wasn't just who they brought to the table, but it was also the efforts that they made to look at the process of what bringing to the table actually means. The powerful thing about this game and this example and the engagements happening in Baltimore even today is that they really work to do the investment on the front end with faith leaders, community leaders, those officials who may not necessarily understand all the nuances of floodplain management, but very much understand the interest of what it means for the community to be resilient against risk from flooding. And it's a wonderful example, ultimately, from a participatory design standpoint of how to gain buy-in, not from the content experts, such as floodplain managers, but from the context experts, the people who can take some of the lessons learned from something like Game of Floods and apply that to the context of everyday life. Now, when we see examples like the example from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the example from the city of Baltimore, we know not only is participatory design plausible, it's practical.
As you can see by these examples and many, many more, at its very core definition, participatory design is a method to collaborate and refers to both strategy and tactic. In these very complex and dynamic times, collaboration is more important than ever, and connectivity challenges are happening all around us, on our teams, within our offices, and across the organizations we work for. Effective communication always starts from the inside, and this is no truer than HWC's support to the NFIP via the Customer-Centered Communications team. I'm a member of C3, and I've seen firsthand how FEMA has been able to lead and introduce innovative strategies and tools that enable participatory design and lead to messaging integration and having partners own their own outreach. The C3 marketing team consulted with FEMA to execute campaigns and outreach initiatives with approaches aimed at ensuring more properties around the country. That participatory design approach enables those teams to collaborate from the inside out with teaming partners, clients, colleagues, regional counterparts, and external audiences. On C3, we employ online and digital tools like whiteboarding platforms, pre-work questionnaires, decision-making matrices, and paper meetings, all in an effort to help our partners arrive at effective outreach and marketing decisions and solutions. Participatory design is all about building relationships. And in this virtual world, virtual engagement certainly needs to be as engaging as the in-person experience. A few best practices we wanted to make sure we share today starts with the need for empathy and the need to practice grace and patience with people. At any point, we can all experience technology glitches, background noise at home, and the ever elusive mute and unmute process. By practicing grace, we understand and take the additional time we need to be there for the folks that we're participating in meetings with. Use the video feature. One thing we have lost without physical meetings is the ability to read nonverbal cues and body language. By enabling your video, you could be helping your participants stay attentive and connect more with what you're presenting. Consider building in breaks to your agenda. This could help combat screen fatigue and loss of attention. Assuming you're using platforms like Microsoft Teams, Skype for Business, or Zoom, consider the chat box as an extra feature to help you echo, agree, support, and acknowledge meeting participants without interrupting the main discussion. Sometimes there's no time to meet. One tool we've found useful is the paper meeting. Instead of virtual meetings, paper meetings help deliver simple information or enable quick decision making via email. And keep it fun. Try dedicating some time on your agenda to water cooler talk. Ask folks to show their pets at home, or find ways to connect around cool quarantainment ideas. Whatever you do, remember, your participants are a lot like you, and if you'd be engaged and enjoy the meeting, they're likely to as well. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining our session today on participatory design for greater stakeholder inclusion and better resilience outcomes. On behalf of HWC, we appreciate the opportunity to join the ASFPM platform, and Alex, Marcus, and I are looking forward to your questions, and stand in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, Amber, and Alex, for your great presentation and the great work that you do. We've got a couple questions, and we've got time for plenty more, so hopefully folks can keep submitting questions in the Q&A chat function. The first one is, what results of successful collaboration efforts have most stood out to each of you?
Marcus, do you want to start?
Sure. When we talk about success in terms of outcomes, I think part of it is making sure people feel the buy-in to stay at the table. And so oftentimes when we have stakeholder engagement efforts, I think particularly for things that may seem highly technical, or like the knowledge base seems like a higher threshold for keeping folks at the table, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to lose people after one or two meetings. And so I think one of the pieces, one of the measures of success is time and grade. I think the other piece, right, is when we can be able to translate some of the actions in a practical and actionable way for community leaders and faith-based leaders to be able to re-articulate to other people in their communities. That's another measure of success. So one of the things we talk about often is the role that people like faith leaders, community-based leaders play in helping to inform, influence, and reinforce the messages that either floodplain managers or emergency managers are trying to get people to consider as it relates to steps they need to take to reduce flood risk. And so I think an easy one right now for folks, as we're looking into hurricane season, right, is one of the actions that we want people to take is really making sure that they are documenting and capturing what things they may lose in the event that they are flooded, but then also what they should consider to buy down some of the flood risk. And so for some, that option may include flood insurance. For others, it may be other mitigation steps to reduce the risk of flooding. And so those are some things that I would consider when we talk about what are some good outcomes or some good indicators that go alongside some of the other community emergency engagement principles. And so, yes, this can be about email clicks, people coming to the websites and things of that nature. But when we start shifting our participatory design and our stakeholder engagement outcomes from that inform part of the spectrum to that collaborate and empower, we often see more ownership from faith-based groups, community groups, and et cetera, to own not just the message, but also the process in which they buy in and engage in reinforcing mitigation steps. Alex, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, since my focus is mostly on the CTP program, one thing I would say is that there are two things that stand out in particular. One was the development of a community of practice, where we were able to get as many stakeholders as possible in a room 2 times a year to do a couple of things. One, educate them and give them a training seminar or webinar on a topic of interest to our CTPs, and we would often poll them and ask them questions about what's of interest to them. And then the other thing too is that as part of each meeting, one meeting every year, we would start to get input from our own technical partners on who are the folks that stand out the most. So then we adopted a CTP recognition program to recognize our stakeholders as well. So we wanted to meet and engage with them at least a couple of times a year, but then we also wanted to recognize them at least one time a year. And normally we actually do it at this conference live, and it's normally a huge success. And you know, one of the things that we heard too, which also stands out for me, is that CTPs were asking for that recognition. And
our goal as facilitators was to listen and try to provide that as best as we could. So we did, and I think so far it's been really successful.
Great. There's been a few questions and interest in the floods game that the Urban Sustainability Directors Network has. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Can communities request it? And then specifically, how do you see it used in the context of, say, floodplain management planning or some sort of planning efforts around floodplain management?
So I think in those early stages of engagement efforts where you're trying to help walk alongside the community to get a sense of the context in which you want to talk about what mitigation actions need to take place, the game of floods is a good example, right, of where you can co-create opportunities to get people involved in that table, right? So play is a big part of learning. I think we all learned that as kids, right? You learn some of the things, some of the social behavioral norms that kind of govern our community. What I appreciate about the game of floods is it complements a lot of the other efforts and interests to a city's hazard mitigations plan, but also gets people thinking and talking about, like, right, what role can I play as we are going through this particular process of this game, and decisions that we can make, not just for my particular facility or for my particular community, but in relation to other places. And so when I think about the game of floods and where its application fits most notably, it's probably going to be somewhere in between that first coffee where you're meeting with some of the community leaders and you guys are kind of just, people are nodding their head that like, oh yes, we actually should worry about floodplain management as well. And maybe one of those before you get too deep into the risk map engagement process, right? And so it can be the thing that serves as a good on-ramp. And that's one of the things that we just wanted to note from the Urban Sustainability Network and their work, is I think they've done a great job of providing some tangible on-ramps that start from the lived experiences of the communities they are seeking to come alongside, rather than starting from a highly technical place and then hoping that that translates down to communities. And we see floodplain managers in the ASFPM community across the country doing different things to really create some of those similar on-ramp experiences. We'll drop the link to the Game of Floods in the chat.
Great. Another question for you all is, what advice do you have for local floodplain managers and their colleagues for conducting effective outreach to communities that you want to engage in the process? And how do you deliver those messages in the best way that will connect with people?
I was going to say, good communication always starts at the grassroots level, right? So you don't want to have like a top-down approach necessarily. You want to be in the community and trying to find ways to engage. And a lot of good communications best practices comes with understanding your audience. So if your community is really technologically savvy, or you have a wealthier community, for example, you might be able to engage in different types of communications best practices than you would if you were in a more rural or poorer community, or a different type of community that just had different communication tools and resources available to them. And I think it's important to audit your audience, know who you're speaking to, and first of all, understand what is the best way to communicate. If you're in a really, in a huge watershed, or if you're in a really, wide expanse, big state like Nevada or something like that, you may say to yourselves, well, we can't always meet in person, so we're going to have to find tools and resources to meet. In fact, because of COVID, we're all being forced to learn how to use technology to meet and to see each other, which I think is very important. But at the end of the day, knowing your audience is important. And then the development of messaging really comes from spending some time to get to know people. I think one of the successes we had, at least with the Cooperating Technical Partners Program, and Mitch, you and I have now known each other for several years because of this, is that we created opportunities to get that face-to-face together when we could. We live in two different parts of the country. We would leverage this conference, for example, to get to know each other, but then take messages back to our communities and begin to share them and refine them based on where you live and the type of people that you're with.
I'd also add that with participatory design, it's a strategy, but it's also a tactic. So knowing that the outreach that folks are doing at the local and state level is not haphazard. These are
long-standing strategies and a lot of thinking and work that goes into it. And so, as Alex mentioned, in terms of communicating from the inside out, PD is a tool to also ensure that your internal stakeholders, your regional folks, your national folks, your community members, that they understand that you're most and foremost interested in a participatory design approach. Just telling folks that that's your intention, that you want to bring as many participants into the conversation early on to either help build a strategy or to help implement one. I think understanding that we can use PD both as a tool to help get consensus internally in our own organizations, on our own teams. We often work in cross-functional teams with people and teams that have different equities or different roles to play in a process. I think just by saying, hey, we have an intentional design method that we use to help make sure that we're building more equitable outcomes, or that we're including all the voices in the building or the implementation or the delivery or even the evaluation, that means that you can use PD as a tool to both build your external engagement and also build that internal consistency that you might need to. So I know that a lot of work that happens at FEMA, obviously takes a great amount of regional engagement and regional leadership, for example. And so that's one way we've seen it work, right? Is making sure, for example, on C3, when we're building out insurance marketing campaigns, that we're asking the regions, we're asking the key critical stakeholders who are going to be a part of seeing the life cycle of this project. Who else needs to be in the conversation? Who needs to be a part of the design? Who needs to be a part of the planning? And that way, you're kind of using PD at every step of the way to just continue to ensure and enable success for outreach and engagement. It's definitely something that can be, again, used with as many as 5 people on a small team, or to promote a nationwide campaign like we're doing on C3. So I think that as much as folks are interested in bringing, equity and inclusion to some of these projects and these programs, PD is just another tool that you can use with the tools that you already have, with the plans that you already have, just to make sure that you're also engaging the right people at every stage of the life cycle of your project.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and presenting this information. And a big thanks to our other presenters, Miriam and Anna and Amber, Alex, and Marcus. And thanks everybody for joining this session. Hope you have a great rest of ASFPM.
Thank you.